Hello, welcome to another episode of the Next Year Power podcast series. I'm your host, IC Atiti. The 2013 privatization of the Nigerian electricity industry aimed to improve efficiency across all subsectors and generally the service delivery to customers. However, almost 10 years post-privatization, the sector is plagued with more frequent challenges, among which are regular grid collapses. These collapses have led to conversations on the possibility of disaggregating the national grid. Today, my guest is Engineer Stephen Olumuyiwa, who is the Transmissions Advisor for the Niger Delta Power Holding Company, and he's going to join us to discuss if the national grid is better divided or not. Welcome, sir. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much, IC. Glad to be here.
So, there have been a series of grid collapses, the sixth and most frequent being on 20th of July. So what exactly causes these collapses?
So a grid collapse occurs essentially when what we call the grid frequency drops to a point that connected generators in the power system are no longer able to cope. So the question then becomes, what are the things that allows or causes the grid frequency to drop to that point? So the grid frequency is that quantity of the electricity itself that defines the critical balance between the generators connected and the demand moment by moment. So there is the regulation that we have for running the grid in the grid code that says that the frequency should be 50 plus or minus 0.5%. That means it can go between 49.75 on the lower side and 50.25 on the higher side. So, and if something now happens, you lose a generator that is carrying a particularly heavy amount of power, or a line connecting the generator to the demand is automatically disconnected because of a fault. The imbalance happens. So you have that scenario that can happen. It means the frequency drops to that point where the machines can no longer go. According to the grid code, once frequency drops to 47.5, those machines are allowed to separate so that they don't get damaged. So that's essentially, technically speaking, what causes grid collapses.
So, is disaggregating the national grid a solution to the frequent grid collapse challenges?
My simple answer to that is no. It is not a solution. When you say you're disaggregating something, you're cutting it up into bits and pieces. So disaggregating the grid will simply make a bad problem much worse. Let's look at how national grids evolve, okay? So why do we need a grid? A grid is put in place because you have generation, which is frequently located at the source of the energy. Of course, there are situations where you transport your primary energy to the load center if it's more economical, but more often than not, for economic reasons, you site your power plants at the source of energy. So you build what we call transmission lines at a suitable voltage level to move your power in bulk to the load center. The load centers are spread all over the country. Now, we have the need for a grid because it's not everywhere in the country that you have generation for primary energy. So that grid is necessary. Now, the more generators you connect to your grid, the stronger your grid becomes, the more resilient your grid becomes. So disaggregating it essentially breaks it down. Now that brings us back to the formal question, right? So the issues that result in grid collapses many times are tied to the structure of the transmission grid. So the structure of the grid, like I've said to you, comprises generators, transmission lines, which passes through substations to load centers. Now, those lines are supposed to be connected all the time, excepting when you switch it off for the purpose of controlling voltage or whatever other quantities that need to be kept within the acceptable bands. But you talk about reliability and make sure that you don't disconnect lines such that it becomes an unreliable route. So why do those lines therefore disconnect? A line disconnects automatically if there's a fault. What do we mean by fault? Vegetation, because these lines pass through dense forests and so on and so forth, lightning strikes or some other things, and the lines automatically disconnect. It's not every time that lines disconnect that you should have a grid collapse. But currently, we have a grid where quite a number of the lines are being out of service for one problem or the other. So the problem is fix it, not disaggregate the grid. If you disaggregate a network that needs fixing, you make a bad problem worse. Also, there is what we call protection. That is the automatic equipment that senses faults and automatically disconnects the lines. Now, they have a hierarchy of coverage such that they should seamlessly operate to allow disconnection without creating a cascade effect. Now, so our grid needs a lot of transmission lines maintenance and appropriate grading of our system protection relay system. So these are the things that need to be done. So simply put, we need to make sure that we are investing in upgrading the grid to avoid collapsing the system frequently.
So would breaking the grid make the transmission subsector much more attractive for investors?
Okay, so attracting investors is the issue here. And we're thinking that breaking up the grid will attract investors. I think it's a wrong approach, but we do need to attract investors. And the way to do it is really to review and tweak the current arrangement where TCN has one transmission system provider and one system operator. Now, we do need one number operator for sanity of the grid, but for the purpose of grid ownership and maintenance, you need to redo the TSP concept we have. What do I mean by this? Okay, so if you have a scenario where after you've done your long-term planning, what we call least cost transmission expansion plan, you want to have more lines this way, more lines that way to connect with power plants and all of that, then allow investors to come in either as on BOT basis, build, operate, and transfer, or build and own. There are various other utilities where you have more than one TSP. Investors, when they come in, they can build their infrastructure. When they build their infrastructure, it's built into the tariff, the wheeling charges, and the regulator can manage all of that so that if, for example, IC comes with some money to build some transmission line between point A and point B, over a period of time, you can recover your investment from the wheeling charges. That's what an electricity market is really all about. It's about infrastructure, investment in infrastructure that facilitates electricity flow to the end user, and the money goes back and people recover their capital over an agreed period of time. So that is the way to do it. It is really the best way to ensure that we tweak this current arrangement where the TSP is just one entity and is unable to manage his current basket of infrastructure. He needs to reinforce, he needs to maintain, he needs to rehabilitate, add more to it. Let's open it up. Let's invite people. Let's review the tariff structure and let all of this be done with an arrangement where the regulator determines the earnings and then it's a win-win.
So Lagos State is currently trying to establish its electricity market. What impact do you think this will have on the country's current transmission subsector?
So it's a good concept. A properly set up electricity market can only enhance the transmission subsector. And I tell you the reason why. Many of the current problems faced by the Nigerian electricity supply industry is traceable to the poor state of our electricity market. The whole value chain from gas or water through the generators, through transmission, to the distributors, to the end users, and the supposed flow back of the resources, the money to pay for the resources and all of the services. There's an imbalance there. And that's a whole issue of discussion on its own. So for Lagos State to be setting up its own electricity market is a good thing. And if they do it right, in other words, you have a scenario that does not create the kind of cash flow issues we have and the threats to bankruptcy for generators it's the best. It helps the transmission subsector a lot. That's my opinion on that.
So we've seen the proposal of ideas like rig fencing and embedded generation to improve electricity supply to customers. For Nigeria, where most customers can't pay reflective tariffs, aren't these ideas more viable than disaggregating the grid?
The concept of having ring-fenced customers and embedded generation excellent is the way to go, especially for portions of the industry that are underserved or perhaps not even served. So the current ongoing arrangements where we see investors coming in, connecting some form of end-to-end, there's a willing buyer, there's a willing seller generator somewhere, and the investor comes in and facilitates the connectivity between the willing seller, a power plant, through the grid, through some other added infrastructure, to the willing buyer, and it's a win-win situation. However, that goes on for a while. It must be said, it will stall if we do not pay attention to the grid itself, because the current arrangement, which is different from what we call off-grid system, really still depends on the grid. So if we continue to implement that, which, like I said, is a good idea and a good thing to do, but if we don't also simultaneously pay attention to the grid itself, it will get to a point where, okay, there's a willing seller somewhere, but the grid is not able to wheel its power through to the willing buyer for the simple reason that perhaps there are too many lines that are out of service or that are moribund or something. So, in other words, it's a good concept and it's the way to go. It should be this plus that. In other words, fix the grid and make sure that we complement it with that scenario.
Thank you very much, Engineer Steve. It's been a pleasure having you on the Next Year Power podcast series.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure being here with you and discussing very important issues.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.